So let me begin by talking about interurbans in the historical context. While most Americans today are familiar with light rail operations, electric railways that connect a variety of cities with suburban areas or to a number of outlying communities, like the San Diego trolley, a misapplied term, they are less likely familiar with historic electric interurbans. By the era of the First World War, the nation had more than 15,000 route miles of electric interurban railways, a construction phenomenon that had occurred with amazing speed. Although the Midwest, especially the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, emerged as the heartland of the electric intercity railroad, the Rocky Mountain West also experienced this new form of intercity transportation. Take Colorado. 5 interurban lines appeared in the Centennial State. 2 operated out of Denver, the Denver and Interurban and the Denver and Intermountain. 1 at Cripple Creek, 1 at Trinidad, and 1 in the Grand River Valley in the westernmost part of the state. In order to fully grasp the interurban era, whether in the Midwest, Colorado, or elsewhere, it makes sense to begin by asking the question, what's an interurban? The word interurban means what its Latin origin says, between cities. It is believed that in the 1890s, Charles Henry, an Anderson, Indiana lawyer, politician, and traction promoter, coined the term. Some, in fact, consider Henry, incorrectly, to be the father of the interurban, having been involved with the construction of the first intercity electric line in the Hoosier State, a small road that opened in 1898. Yet the first interurban to become part of a general network of electric railways appeared in central Ohio, the Newark and Granville Street Railway, and locals pronounce it Newark, Ohio. Keep that in mind. It opened between the communities of its corporate names in December 1889. Then, in 1891, the 11-mile Fidalgo City and Anacortes Railway started operations in Washington State, and 2 years later, the East Side Railway began service between Portland and Oregon City. Debate developed about whether all electric railroads that operated between municipalities should be called interurbans. As electricity after 1888 made animal, cable, and steam dummy street railways obsolete, electric streetcar owners, especially in New England, but elsewhere as well, started to construct rural trolleys. These operations linked multiple but often suburban communities, and usually their lightly built track structure, which commonly featured little grading, appeared on or adjacent to county roads. Equipment was nearly always identical to the rolling stock that transported riders along city streets, being small open cars in the summer and closed ones in the winter. And their standards of operations were essentially those of street railways. But true interurbans, in the minds of many, operated alongside public roads or on straight tangent track, owned larger pieces of rolling stock, and functioned more like steam railroads. There were also electric lines, particularly in Pennsylvania, that had characteristics of both rural trolleys and interurbans, explaining the difficulty in making a correct taxonomy. Early in the 20th century, the U.S. Bureau of the Census classified as interurban electric railways that provided rural or intercity services. Then in 1912, the Bureau believed that it had resolved the issue by permitting each railway to select its own classification. And this was a classic bureaucratic cop-out. A good definition, however, was offered in 1907 by a New York City investment banker. He considered bona fide interurbans to be, quote, more than 15 miles in length, which have at least 2/3 of their track outside of municipal limits and operate their cars at a maximum speed of not less than 20 miles an hour. The question to be asked now, why were interurbans popular? Just as the steam railroad became popular for multiple reasons, most of all as a replacement technology that was faster and more dependable than any contemporary land, river, lake, or canal transport, much the same can be said of the interurban. Once individuals, investors, and others grasped the potential of electric intercity railways, they realized the advantages of this alternative to steam for passenger travel over short and intermediate distances and for express and small lot freight shipments. In general terms, the reason for the growing popularity of interurbans involved the widespread perception that they perform, quote, a service for mankind as notable and perhaps ultimately as great as that rendered by its steam-operated precursor, unquote. There was the common belief that an interurban could solve shortcomings of the existing steam railroad network. Remarked a contemporary industry spokesman, if your town was left out or stuck on a branch line, you had another chance with a trolley. For some transportation-starved or badly served residents, an interurban appeared to be their last best hope, not realizing, of course, that the automobile would develop rapidly beyond its gestation stage. But as the 20th century dawned, motor cars barely existed. Nationally in 1901, only 14,800 were registered and no trucks whatsoever. Americans saw interurbans providing a range of benefits. Passenger travel was clean, avoiding the nuisance and discomfort of smoke, soot, sparks, or cinders. And having ridden the Durango-Silverton train recently, I still seem to have pieces of cinders in my disappearing hair. Riders could comfortably ride on warm days with windows open and wear their Sunday best clothes or take open cars, popular during those summer months. Also, farmers did not need to fear hot embers from passing steam locomotives, setting fire to their fields, pastures, or woodlots. And interurban rolling stock appeared benign. Commented an interurban traveler in 1903, quote, there are a good many elderly men and women who are still rather afraid of the locomotive. Compared with an engine and train of coaches, a trolley car is rather an innocent-looking affair. Some contemporaries remarked about their visual experiences in an interurban car being strikingly different from that of a common railway coach. And I quote, you can see out of both sides and the back and at times the front as well. You can't do that with a locomotive tender and baggage and mail cars ahead of you, and you probably had other cars behind you. Since interurban companies gladly rented their equipment for group outings, such arrangements became fashionable. Proclaimed an industry source, the chartered car appeals to the feeling of exclusiveness, sense of ownership, and comfort beloved by most human beings. Resembling steam road local, branch, and short-line trains, there was also an informality to interurban travel. Quote, most of the train crews knew their regular clientele on a first-name basis, and they were not above doing such tasks as running errands for a housewife along the line or seeing to the safe arrival of an unescorted child at his destination. Attractive schedules attracted travelers. Electric roads dispatch cars more frequently than their steam counterparts. While a steam railroad might provide double daily service on its lines, interurbans commonly operated throughout the day and evening on perhaps hourly schedule. And by way of local example, not a good scan, but this is from my 1906 Colorado and Southern Public timetable. So when the Denver and Interurban opened in 1908, it generally operated on an hourly schedule through Broomfield, and according to the CNS timetable, population 60, while the Colorado and Southern dispatched only 3 daily round trips through the village and stopped only on Flag. Interurban track speeds could be as great or greater than their steam counterparts, although limited trains on steam roads were true ballast scorchers. Although some of the larger interurbans dispatched their version of limited or mostly non-stop cars, all companies provided excellent local service. Patrons liked that cars stopped almost everywhere. By using a hand signal in the day or a lantern, lighted match, or burning newspaper at night, the observant motorman stopped to pick up a rider, whether at a trackside shelter or a roadside crossing. Furthermore, cars went into the heart of a city or town, eliminating the need to walk or pay for a hack or omnibus from a remote or inconvenient depot. And let me note that when railroads were being built in the antebellum period and even later, most of the communities in the East, or at least many, certainly in New England, were already established. And so the railroad often was forced to establish its station in a more remote area. And if you had a place like southern New England, the railroad often went through the valleys and the town was on the hill. So it was not particularly convenient in many locations. The list of positive continued. Sound like a salesman for an interurban company. When it came to fares, interurbans nearly always charged less per mile than steam roads, perhaps 2 or 3 cents or even less, rather than the 4 or 5 cents or more for their counterparts. In order to attract commercial travelers and other regular riders, including commuters and school children, electric roads commonly offered coupon ticket books, making trips even cheaper. And in an age of railroad carnage, interurbans proved safer, having fewer deaths and injuries per passenger mile than their steam counterparts. All these factors had great appeal. The public realized quickly that interurban express service could surpass what steam roads provided. For individuals who demanded faster delivery times for package and less than carload, LCL shipments, electric cars made a real difference. An interurban with its merchandise dispatch service might deliver a shipment in a few hours, what otherwise took much longer for a steam carrier. Customers commonly received same-day or overnight service, whether for a piece of furniture or an order of dry goods, drugs, or hardware. Operational costs contributed to the popularity of interurban projects. Even though the price tag for equipping an electric road exceeded that of a steam short line of comparable size, once installations occurred, savings multiplied. There was no need for cooling towers and water tanks, and routine maintenance on an electric car was cheaper than that for the iron horse. Labor costs were also less. 2-man crews were typical, and not the 5 or more found on a steam passenger or freight train. Then there was the nightmare of public roads. In South Carolina, we have the nightmare of public roads. We don't want to tax anyone to repair them. But this has been a long-standing concern. Generations of travelers had cursed road conditions, especially in those places plagued by a vicious and viscous brand of mud, that ubiquitous gumbo. This old saying rang true: be sure to choose your rut carefully. You will be in it for a very long time. Efforts, though, had been made by the early 20th century to improve public roads, including plank, macadamized, gravel, and brick services. Yet out of the national network of 2.2 million miles of roads prior to World War I, about 2 million miles consisted of dirt construction, and only later did all-weather roads become more common. Even when motorists took to the roadways during dry conditions, they needed to wear goggles and linen dusters for protection from clouds of choking dust that every passing automobile raised. In 1903, an observer said this about the motor car: Automobiling is a brave pastime for the rich who do not mind getting down on their backs in the road and hammering straight up at bolts and things with grease dripping down in their faces. Sound like fun? Growing automobile usage led to increased local and state spending for roadways, and in 1916 the federal government started to back financially the good roads cause, but only after the interurban era was in full swing. If the obvious advantages for passengers and express, package, and freight operations were not enough, there was another recognized benefit of having an electric road: rising property values. Examples abound. With completion of the Kansas City, Clay County, and St. Joseph Railway in 1913, a well-built interurban that linked Kansas City and St. Joseph, it was reported that, quote, land near the line has increased 50%. Farms worth $30,000 previous to this construction are now held at $60,000. And there was more, quote, not only has there been a great increase in farmland, but also in city property, unquote. An interurban prospectus said it well and simply. Quote, the construction and operation of the road will enhance the value of farm and other lands adjacent to its lines, unquote. It was also generally believed, at least before the disastrous panic of 1907, that interurban securities, stocks and bonds, were sound investments, being appropriate instruments for protecting assets of widows and orphans. If an interurban, large or small, had become involved in electric power generation and distributions, prospects looked bright for good stock appreciation and uninterrupted bond interest payments. When compared to the infant motor car industry with scores of struggling companies, an interurban company was seen as a safer investment than any automobile concern. And just think about this. We'll see some images of interurban cars, but you have an interurban car next to, let's say, a 1904 Oldsmobile. So what company would you invest in? An interurban, like a big, powerful steam road car, and then this contraption that looked like really a horseless carriage. So the smart money obviously would go to the interurbans. People do make mistakes, right? The interurban rail corridor offered an attraction of its own, blending into the natural scene. Quote, the lighter trolley line, which can follow the natural lay of the land, is less disfiguring to the landscape than the heavily graded steam road, opined a contemporary. From a purely aesthetic standpoint, a ride by trolley offers many more attractions than travel on steam cars between the same points. Said another, interurban travel means that there is a greater association with the land that you are going through. There existed that hill and dale dimension to many lines, especially those rural trolleys that often ran on or alongside public roads. As good times returned following the 1907 panic, an interurban executive reviewed America's excitement for his industry, and I quote, there is an awakening and thrill of life in every town and village through which an interurban runs. Commercial opportunities which lay dormant are made possible and become profitable realities. New markets are opened. The reciprocal relations which develop between the city and town and between the village and farm are beneficial to all. He added, summing up interurban development throughout the United States, we find that this new means of transportation has won favor with rich and poor alike. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been saved to people in reduced fares, while the enhancement in the value of lands contiguous to interurban lines has reached millions of dollars. Investments in interurban lines, which have been properly located, financed, constructed, and operated, have yielded substantial profits, and their securities are sought by conservative investors. So who, most of all, wanted and patronized the interurban? The answer is straightforward. Farmers, villagers, commercial salesmen, commuters, and pleasure seekers. It would be farmers who arguably became the most avid supporters of inner-city electric traction. Agrarians considered the interurban to be a practical way to enhance their incomes and quality of life, mitigating the drudgery and long hours of farm work and ending their rural imprisonment. When it came to the passenger business, interurban companies depended heavily on two classes of riders: farmers, villagers and their families riding to a town or city, and commercial travelers going from one city or town to another. Traction roads also relied heavily on agricultural traffic. Farmers regularly used LCL services provided by conventional passenger equipment and box or express motors to market their dairy products, eggs, fruit, and truck produce, and on some lines to ship carloads of livestock, grain, and other bulk commodities. And here's a classic view. This is from the Fort Dodge, Des Moines and Southern, about 1914, and notice the milk cans in the baggage area. And when it came to carload lots, we find some railroads, like the Indiana Railroad, which was a reorganization of several troubled interurbans in the Hoosier State, that provided stock car service, allowing farmers online to take advantages of upticks in the hog or cattle markets. Observed in Ohio interurban company early in the century, quote, "The novelty and luxury of riding on the traction cars has now become a necessity with rural populations." In addition to personal travel and shipping advantages, interurbans increased farming efficiencies. One involved labor. Inner-city traction created a more mobile workforce, whether that of the surplus farmhand during the dull season, finding employment in town, or that of the, quote, city dweller who is brought to the farm when he is most needed and when wages are the highest, unquote. Then there was the more beneficial use of a farmer's time. If a machine part required replacement, a telephone call to the implement or hardware dealer meant that the needed item would arrive in less than a day or sooner, by passenger car or express motor. If a chore necessitated a trip to town, there was this advantage. Quote, "Farmers lacking interurban access are now compelled to take their teams off important work in order to send some member of the family or helpers to town," unquote. One attraction of the interurban for the agrarian was a possibility of bringing electricity to farming operations. Quote, "Cheap and convenient power had real appeal." Quote, "The time will come," prophesied an interurban executive, "when on farms near electric roads, fields will be plowed and harvested, machinery operated, even cows milked by the same power which takes the farmer's family to town and his products to market." Although field work became the bailiwick of gasoline tractors and other pieces of internal combustion machinery, electricity lighted farmsteads, operated milking machines, and provided power for other chores. Said a traction advocate in 1908, quote, "The farmers may have an economical and very satisfactory electric light service in their house and barns, thus reducing work of care for lamps as well as the danger of fire or explosions from lanterns, lamps in the barns, sheds, etc., unquote. The farm wife likewise grasped the advantages of an interurban. She may have been a family member who managed the farm accounts, realizing that electric traction reduced operating costs and bolstered income. Since so many farm women relied on eggs and dressed poultry for their pin money, the interurban made these sales practical and profitable. In addition to cash money, farm wives commonly traded their produce, most commonly butter, for essential items from the grocer or other merchants. This is a woman who is waiting at the Norman's flag stop on the Washington and Old Dominion Railway in Virginia. She's going to town. I assume. Then there were the social and cultural advantages. If so inclined, the women of the farm could easily pay social visits to family and friends in town or city, participate in a sewing or quilting circle, or attend church and club functions. While the family might continue to worship in its country or village church, a new denomination in an urban center might make for a more satisfying spiritual life, whether it be Christian Science or a Pentecostal faith. A farm wife might encourage, perhaps dragoon, her husband and children to attend a concert, play, or related event. A library or museum might also be a personal or family destination. Mental health benefits likely came with electric railways. Quote, "It is fair to presume that the loneliness of the farmer's life is at an end," speculated the Chicago Tribune in 1907. And it can take his wife and children in a few minutes be dropped at the nearest crossroads or even at the village for the city, which was visited only once in a season when the roads were good and when the general farm team was not otherwise occupied, unquote. As the interurban era dawned, and that would be in the 1890s, a magazine writer observed that monotony and loneliness on a farmstead could be devastating, and asked, why do the insane asylums hold such an enormous proportion of farmers' wives? Isolation was a contributing factor. Quote, "Every day of her life she goes through the drudgery, monotonous round of work," unquote. Interurban travel affected farm children. Boys and girls could attend school in town or city and not have to trudge to that little red schoolhouse with its lone teacher who managed grades 1 through 8. Later, they did not need to stay in town in order to attend an academy or high school. Commuting daily became practical and not that expensive. Just as the quality of life improved for the children's parents, the same held true for the children of agriculture. Quote, "A boy can remain at home, do his work on the farm during the day, and yet take his girl to the theater or to a lecture or a dance that night and get home in time to do the chores in the morning at least," observed a journalist. The farmers are coming oftener to the city. They find that they can get city types of clothes as cheaply as they formerly could the antiquated garments which once distinguished the agriculturalist. The gawky country boy and girl is disappearing so rapidly, they will soon be of little material in that line left for the comic weeklies, because this type is being wiped out by the interurban railroad. Offspring who had completed their education might take jobs in the city, but still be attached to a farm or village. Quote, "Often a son or daughter who has obtained employment in a store or factory and who would formerly have been obliged to board in the city, visiting the home folks once or twice a month over Sunday, is now able to live at home under its wholesome restraints." And indeed, there had been that long-standing notion of the wicked city. So the interurban will allow individuals to take advantage of job opportunities in the wicked city, but leave after 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Unlike the vast majority of farmers, some villagers expressed misgivings about the developing interurban era. These concerns came mostly from owners of retail businesses. Would not electric cars draw away customers to larger towns and cities? Such worries promoted merchants in the small college town of Oberlin, Ohio, to object strongly to a proposed interurban that would link their community with Cleveland. "Ruin," proclaimed a handbill that was distributed in 1897. And I quote, "follows in the wake of the electric railroad. Elyria has 3 steam railways and 2 electric roads. Result, 6 big business failures recently, and 5 of them within 3 days. Oberlin has one steam railway, with rotten service I might note, and no electric railroad. Result, one small business failure in 25 years. But not all village merchants shared that outlook. Some village and small town businessmen considered the interurban a good thing. And this is a report that the federal government, through the Bureau of Commerce and Labor, took early in the century. And these are various responses. Quote, sales have increased over 50% in 5 years. Can get goods more promptly. Sales rapidly increasing. Country prospering. Aid in getting goods. Easier to get goods. Carry less stock, unquote. These retailers could partake of what today would be called just-in-time deliveries, materially speeding the flow of goods through the distribution channels. This better way of receiving inventory is seen in this illustration. Quote, the rapid service of the Traction Express allows the merchant to sell chairs with the same certainty of delivery as though he had them in his own stockroom, unquote. And there was this observation. With the arrival of interurban electric cars and rural free deliveries and telephones and many other improvements in rural districts, a pace of progression has set in, even in the most out-of-the-way village, that is rapidly changing the ideas and methods of the country merchant. Another writer said much the same thing. The village merchant at first was startled at the possible competition of the great city stores. Then he found he could solve the problem by the use of this means of transportation, which has brought the city competition to him. All he had to do was to increase his stock, add to its variety, discard unsaleable types, and study modern styles. Even though this photograph was taken in the late 1930s in the village of Chesterfield, Indiana, which is near Muncie, it could have been taken decades earlier. So here we have an interurban car stopping on the main street, the principal street in Chesterfield, and making it very easy for individuals then to perhaps go to Muncie or some other metropolis in Hoosier land. And of course, here is a young woman about to get a bicycle that's being taken out of the baggage compartment of a Washington and Old Dominion interurban car. I'm sure it's an exciting day for her and perhaps for her family. Convenience. The arrival of the interurban might produce this positive effect on a village: population growth. The community could attract permanent residents from outlying farms, quote, who because of the improved methods of transportation can reach their farm easily, unquote. A retired farm couple might take advantage of the amenities of the larger towns and cities while remaining in their familiar neighborhoods and no longer needing to maintain a horse and buggy. Retail trade and local economic interests would certainly benefit from this growth. It would be the automobile and improved roads and changes in commercial agriculture, however, that by the mid-20th century made so many American villages and small towns broken communities. Then there were the commercial travelers. These men who traveled from place to place selling their wares or services have long been a part of the nation's commercial scene. With the developing railway age, these commercial representatives, called drummers, commercial travelers, or knights of the grip, began to patronize steam cars to make their towns. Although less numerous than farmers and villagers, the ranks of commercial travelers grew steadily. By the dawn of the last century, there was an estimated 500,000 traveling salesmen in the country, and it didn't take long for them to appreciate the interurban. Here we have, a little fuzzy, a drummer, that's the nicely dressed gent there on the left, about to board a car on the Illinois traction system in Decatur, Illinois. And these young women are students at Millikan University. And, better image, This is Lakeshore Electric. Perhaps a traveling salesman has just alighted from the car and is able to walk to the hotel and perhaps make other visits, and could then get on his way maybe in 2 or 3 hours. And there would be a car, probably only a few minutes waiting time for him. The arrival Convenience and time were essential into making the most of a commercial traveler's occupation. He usually wanted to be in the heart of a community and to make as many visits as possible. It was common for him to utilize sample rooms, temporary showrooms that hotels provided, a venue where he could display his wares and meet customers. The interurban was ideal. Cars traveled to commercial centers either on their own tracks or over city streetcar lines. Steam roads, perhaps built after the town or city was established, might have their stations in inconvenient locations, as I noted earlier. Commercial travelers could usually alight from a car in front of their destination, and their sample cases could be delivered promptly. If they traveled on a steam road, he would need the commercial traveler to find and pay a drayman. Frequent electric cars offered another advantage. Drummers might not even think about consulting a timetable or need to juggle their travel itineraries based on limited steam car service. Quote, salesmen soon learn that the frequent schedules suit their convenience, and they are not compelled to arrange their plans to suit the convenience of the train schedules. Said another, commercial travelers can come and go at any hour of the day, where previously they had to spend half their time waiting for trains. In those communities that had just one train a day, it would be roughly 24 hours before they could go to the next town. And the price of this convenient travel was right. Interurbans not only did not charge for sample cases and trunks, but they offered discount coupon books that cut out their out-of-pocket costs or reduced them. For example, Midwestern drummers who used more than 35 connecting electric railroads in 1910 could buy $12 worth of travel for only $10, permitting them to make their trips in multiple directions from their home community even less expensive than the already competitive with steam road fares. Tens of thousands of commuters also depended on interurbans. The principal groups consisted of individuals who lived in suburban or rural areas and used the cars to travel to and from work, and school children and college students who relied on electric railways to further education. Electric roads did much to generate this journey to work traffic. Their promoters and owners often became involved in suburban real estate development, creating interurban additions to cities and towns and establishing more remote communities. They considered electric lines as adjuncts to their land speculation and exploited desires of urbanites who wished to escape the hustle and bustle of smoky, congested, and crime-ridden cities. By way of illustration, the Denver and Interurban Railway, working with the Coleman Selling Company, glorified the, quote, beautiful Lakeview Valley, you know where that is, unquote, that was, quote, only 20 minutes from Denver on the new Boulder Electric Line. The promotional copy made this claim, quote, Lakeview Valley is the most beautiful garden spot in Colorado, away from the noise, dust, and infection of the city, surrounded by green fields, lakes, and romantic hills. It has an uninterrupted view of 150 miles of snow-capped mountains that, though a long way off, yet because of the absolute purity of the atmosphere, seem but a little distance, unquote. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't think Google knows that.
Oh, okay. As another incentive, still talking about the Denver and Interurban, quote, chicken and squabs can be raised and splendid profits made by selling them in Denver. There is plenty of good pasture for cows, and the creamery of the town will buy the milk. And here we have a commuter scene outside of Washington, D.C. in Rosslyn, Virginia. Cars of the Washington, Arlington, and Falls Church. And commuters are getting ready to board the car for their home. Then there were those interurbans, albeit a minority, that depended upon the workday commuter for a substantial portion of their passenger revenues. Thousands of daily riders who represented a wide spectrum of the public relied on such well-built electrics as the Chicago South Shore and South Bend, the New York Westchester and Boston, and the Pacific Electric. The Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee, for one, became one of these well-patronized commuter roads. In 1921, for example, it carried almost 12 million largely commuter passengers, and it would continue to serve commuters until its abandonment in 1963. With rural and suburban students, when rural and suburban students had access to an interurban line, their options for a better education increased. Examples are plentiful. Early on, rural students who wished to attend Elyria High School in Ohio found that the Lakeshore Electric made it a realistic possibility. Of the 363 students who attended the secondary school in 1906, 125 lived in the surrounding countryside and used the electric cars, and of these, quote, at least 2/3 would be unable to attend but for the interurban road, unquote. Several interurbans contracted with boards of education to provide cars exclusively for students, certainly not their best equipment. The Sacramento Northern, for one, operated morning and afternoon school trains between Oakland and Concord, California, and for years these trips customarily required 5 cars. College students were also a part of the commuter mix. Students could conveniently and economically attend classes in another community while living at home. Colleges themselves might become proactive and encourage, even finance, an interurban connection. The newly established and financially struggling Westminster College, located on a, quote, high point of land northwest of Denver, unquote, wanted its students to be able to avoid a steep mile-long walk to campus from the Westminster station of the Denver and Interurban. Not long after this tiny Presbyterian college opened, its administrators asked the company to build a branch to serve them directly. The Interurban agreed, and construction crews installed this electrified appendage that possessed excessively steep grades. Although Westminster College relied on the resources of the Denver and Interurban for an electric connection, another small, albeit durable, institution of higher education, Bethel College, a Mennonite school located north of Newton, Kansas, helped to finance its link to intercity traction. This involved the Arkansas Valley Railway. Administrators at the school were troubled that, quote, students and teachers and visitors to the college have to tramp through mud, rain, and storm to reach our campus, unquote. Action followed. Friends of Bethel subscribed $20,000 for bonds to pay most of the cost of the short Arkansas Valley interurban extension, and cars soon arrived. The eventful day occurred on October 25th, 1913. And here the AVI car is literally in front of the old main or main campus structure. College students appreciated, perhaps most of all, an easy way to leave campus, especially when rigid rules about behavior were enforced. Those males who attended Denison University, a Baptist school in Granville, Ohio, took advantage of the Newark and Granville Street Railway, a later component of the sprawling Ohio Electric Railway. Quote, those residents in dormitories or village homes were appreciative of the new opportunities for shopping and amusement outside Granville, wrote the university historian. He continues. Patrons of the Owl Car, that's the last one, running from Newark, after 11 o'clock on Saturday night would not be noted for sobriety. Bars and brothels already gave the county seat, Newark, the air of a sinful Rome over against its college Athens, which is Granville. Military personnel frequently became part-time commuters, resembling some students. There were various interurbans that reached directly or with streetcar connections a variety of Army and Navy bases. The North Shore line was one, becoming exceptionally busy during World War II. Explained the company in 1942. The North Shore serves two of the nation's most important Army and Navy establishments, Fort Sheridan and Great Lakes Naval Training Station. In effect, this is the same as though several densely populated new cities had suddenly been added to the many important ones the railroad already serves. And the North Shore Line asked civilians, and I quote, "Schedule your trips as not to conflict with the heavy Army and Navy furlough traffic out of Chicago and Milwaukee on Saturday and Sunday nights." And I'm sure most people didn't want to deal with those very happy members of the armed forces, at least Saturday night, maybe even Sunday night. Students and sailors considered interurbans a necessity, but also they were a means to find enjoyment. Pleasure seekers of various types flocked to the cars. A trip itself was usually a pleasant experience. "I loved to ride those cars out of Indianapolis," remarked a former resident. "It was exciting to see the bustle in the streets, to observe the farms, and to view the woodlands and streams." This is a view of riding an interurban car through the Pennsylvania countryside on the Hagerstown and Frederick. No different from streetcar companies, interurban roads realized that the greatest generator of weekend and seasonal passenger business, and hence revenues, came from a variety of popular destinations. These included amusement parks, amphitheaters, dance halls, country and state fairs, picnic grounds, bathing beaches, scenic attractions, baseball diamonds, racetracks, and campsites, or a combination of these attractions. Without a pleasure-drawing venue, Sundays would be a slow traffic days. I mean, after all, farm families and village shoppers might remain at home, and commercial travelers and commuters would not likely be on the move. Virtually every interurban claimed some attraction, and I have yet to find any good example of an interurban that didn't have some type of attraction. Even the tiniest interurbans. In my home community of Elbia, Iowa, we had two interurbans. One was the Elbia Interurban, later the Elbia Light and Railway Company, and by golly, it had a dance hall and a picnic grove on its hawking line. Such a facility at trackside or nearby was considered a surefire traction builder. The Denver Interurban, as you know, ballyhooed El Springs for summertime riders. And I quote, "At El Dorado Springs, you can enjoy swimming in the radium pool or live in a delightful mountain cottage." That sound good? And here we have a 1912 view of passengers going to Rye Beach, which was one of several amusement parks attractions of this type on the Lakeshore Electric, a company that linked Cleveland with Toledo. Its biggest camp or attraction was Cedar Point, which was often called the Atlantic City of the Midwest. And even in the first year of operation, which was in 1902, the Lakeshore Electric handled about 12,000 passengers to and from Cedar Point. All interurban travelers, pleasure seekers or not, might encounter problems. Their experiences were usually no different from those who took other forms of public transportation. Pickpockets might work their trade in crowded cars, and riders might be exposed to communicable disease, including the deadly influenza pandemic that spread throughout the country toward the end of World War I. There were also delays caused by broken equipment, floods, wind, ice, and snowstorms. Occasionally, passengers became rowdy, especially young men who might pull down the trolley pole, rock a lightweight car off the tracks, or engage in some type of unacceptable behavior. Boys will be boys, right? What can be said about the interurban era? No major American enterprise has risen and fallen so rapidly as did the electric interurban. Although the business was relatively stable through the era of World War I, a noticeable decline set in by the early 1920s and became strikingly apparent later in that decade. Toward the end of the 1930s, the industry was in shambles. Mileage stood at 15,470 in 1918, dropped to 12,200 in 1928, and plunged to 4,600 miles by 1938. The culprits were the automobile, the truck, the good roads movement, lack of proper interurban maintenance and betterments, and the Great Depression of the 1930s. Yet electric inner-city railways during their prime served the public well and also functioned as a link between steam railroads and automobiles and trucks. I think we can certainly see that. This is the linkage. People became accustomed to having greater mobility, greater freedom in terms of scheduling their day's activities. Steam railroads, limited service usually, and of course, with the coming of the automobile, if the automobile functioned properly and if there were decent roads, why take the interurban? Well, it is dangerous to say what is past as prologue, although that is on the National Archives. The recent popularity of light rail systems, which today total about 1,500 route miles, reveals a renewed interest in this form of transit. Unquestionably, reasons for a gestating new interurban era resemble why electric interurban traction first appeared: convenience, attractiveness, real estate development, and civic pride. Still, the electric interurban fury that once gripped the country, including parts of Colorado, is not likely to return, although for some American inner-city light rail lines will be a part of their travel experience. So the interurban era came and it went with a few